Wyoming Territory, August 1882. The sun was bleeding out behind the hills when she stumbled from the back of the wagon, legs shaking, dirt caked to her dress, and not a bite of food in her belly for nearly 2 days. Her name was Verona Pratt, 22 years old, born in Missouri and widowed before her second wedding anniversary. She had followed her brother's wagon trail west, chasing the promise of land and a new start, but what she got was a broken axle and a party that moved on without her. Dust clung to her lashes as she took another step and nearly collapsed. Her hands braced the dry earth, but her pride would not let her fall. Not yet. The cowboy saw her from his firelight. He had been alone for weeks, riding fence lines and checking cattle for the Bar M ranch. A quiet man with rough hands and a sharper gaze, Weston Field had made peace with his own ghosts long ago, or so he thought. He rose from his haunches when he saw her, a woman swaying like a wind-blown pine, her dress torn at the sleeve, her eyes sunken from hunger. "Stop right there," he called, not unkindly but cautious. "You hurt." She looked up with dry lips and a voice so hoarse it barely carried. "Just need to sit." He stepped closer, boots crunching over the dry grass. "You alone out here?" "My wagon broke 3 days back." "They left without me." He knelt, his shadow stretching over her. "You eaten?" She shook her head. He stood again, walked back to the fire, and returned with his cast iron pan and a tin plate. He crouched, scooped a helping of beans and salt pork, and held it out. She stared at it like it might disappear. Then she took the plate with trembling fingers. "Thank you." Weston watched her eat, slow and careful, like she thought it might be taken away. She barely looked up, but when she did, her eyes were more green than brown, sharp despite her hunger. "Name's Weston Field," he said. "Verona." He nodded once. "You from around Missouri?" She stilled, spoon halfway to her mouth. "Yes, how did you know?" Accent, "My mother was from there." He leaned back on his heels. "You got family in these parts?" "No. Just my brother, but his wagon's a day ahead by now, maybe more." "Then you will need a place to sleep. I have a spare blanket and room by the fire." Verona hesitated, her pride still clinging to her like the dust on her dress, but her limbs were weak and the stars were already out. "You do not strike me as the kind of man who takes advantage," she said. "I am not." She set the empty plate aside and nodded. "Then I will sleep by the fire." That night, Weston did not press her with questions. He handed her a blanket and turned his back as she settled in. The wind was cool, but the fire was warm, and for the first time in days, Verona felt her body release its tight hold on fear. She watched him from under lowered lashes. He was tall, lean but strong, with a jaw that looked like it had taken a few hits in its time. He had not asked for anything. He had just given. In the morning, she woke to coffee boiling and the smell of biscuits cooking in the skillet. Weston had already saddled his horse and was checking the horizon. "You ride?" he asked without turning. "Not well." "Then you will ride behind me." "I cannot leave you here, and there is no town for 20 miles. You are riding with me to the ranch." She blinked. "Why are you doing this?" He looked back at her then, his eyes steady. "Because I would not want my sister left out here to die alone." "And I reckon you deserve better than that." Verona's throat tightened. She nodded once, rose, and folded the blanket. They rode out an hour later, her arms around his waist, her cheek near his shoulder. She did not speak much, but there was a quiet trust forming in the space between them, held together by the rhythm of hoofbeats and the smell of sage on the wind. By sundown, Weston led her through the gates of the Bar M, a modest spread nestled between the hills. An older woman came out from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "You bring home strays now, Weston?" "She is not a stray," he said. "She is staying a few days, maybe longer. Verona, this is Miss Lorna. She cooks better than me and talks more too." Verona managed a small smile. "I am grateful, truly." Miss Lorna gave her a once-over and nodded. "Well, come in then. You look half-starved and burnt to a crisp." As Verona stepped into the house, something shifted in her chest. It was not quite peace, not yet, but it was the closest she had felt to it in a long time. Later that night, as Weston stood on the porch watching the sky turn dark, Verona stepped beside him. "My husband died last winter," she said softly. "Fever took him. Everything after that just unraveled." He turned his head only slightly. "I am sorry." She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. Thank you, I think I stopped believing anything good could happen after that. Weston was quiet for a long moment, then he said, I stopped believing too a while back, lost my father to a fire. Then my brother fell through the ice 2 years later. After that, I just stayed out here, easier that way. She looked up at him. But you helped me. I did. Why? His eyes moved over her face, quiet and steady. Because something told me you were worth helping. Verona did not look away. No one has said that to me in a long time. I meant it. They stood there as the stars came out, the air full of crickets and the crackle of the porch lantern. Verona leaned a little closer. Is it all right if I stay, just a little while? Weston nodded, his voice low, as long as you want. And for the first time in months, she felt the smallest ember of hope flicker to life inside her. The first morning she woke under a roof again, Verona stared at the beams above her with a quiet unease, the kind that came from not knowing where you'd fit in once the world around you stopped falling apart. The bed was narrow but clean, the quilt tucked with a practiced hand. A window let in pale dawn light and the smell of dew settling over dry grass. She sat up slowly, muscles stiff from days of strain, and moved to the wash basin. The pitcher beside it held cool water. She rinsed her face, then paused at her reflection in the small mirror nailed to the wall. Her hair, near black and uncombed, fell in uneven waves. Her eyes looked older than they had in Missouri. Downstairs, the house was already awake. A kettle rattled on the stove, and Miss Lorna's voice carried softly as she spoke to someone outside. Verona stepped into the kitchen just as Weston came in through the back door. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, collar open, dust clinging to his cuffs. You sleep? He asked, leaning to unlace his boots by the door. Well enough, she said, wrapping her arms around herself. It's strange, feeling safe again. He looked up at that, eyes meeting hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then he nodded once. It takes getting used to. Miss Lorna waved her toward the table. Sit. There's bread and boiled eggs, and I won't have you turning to smoke in front of me. Verona obeyed, grateful for the food but more so for the steadiness of it all. She ate slowly, aware of Weston moving around the room, taking a tin cup of coffee and stepping back outside. After a while, Miss Lorna sat down across from her. Her hands were thick with work, nails trimmed short. You plan to look for your brother? Verona swallowed. If I had a way to travel, I might try, but I don't know where they were headed after the last stop. He didn't say. Miss Lorna's voice softened. Sometimes the ones who leave don't mean to stay gone, but they do. She stood and gathered the dishes. You're welcome here until you know what comes next. Weston's word carries weight. Verona looked at the door where he'd gone. He doesn't say much. He's not in the habit of wasting breath, Miss Lorna said, rinsing the plates. But when he says something, you can be sure he means it. Later that morning, Verona stepped out into the yard, the sun already warming the boards under her feet. Weston was leading a bay mare into the corral, his shoulders bent slightly with the reins in hand. She paused at the edge of the porch. Is there something I can do? He looked over the horse's back. You ever worked with stock before? No, but I'm not afraid of learning. He motioned her in. This one needs brushing down and her hooves checked. She favors her left side. Verona crossed the yard, skirts gathered in one hand, and took the brush when he handed it to her. She moved slowly, watching his hands as he showed her how to keep the mare calm, how to talk low and steady. My mother kept chickens, she said after a while. That's about the extent of my animal experience. Weston crouched and tapped the mare's fetlock gently. Chickens have their own kind of logic. They're mean, she said, and he gave a brief, surprised sound, more breath than laugh, but not far from it. They worked in quiet rhythm until the mare stood easier and her tail flicked lazily. Weston straightened and dusted his hands on his trousers. You did well, he said. Verona wiped her forehead with her sleeve. I don't like sitting idle. If I stay, I want to earn it. He met her eyes. Then you will, she nodded, the words meaning more than she let on. The wind shifted, and with it came the scent of prairie sage and distant pine. Something in her chest eased. That afternoon, Miss Lorna handed her a basket and pointed to the small garden plot behind the barn. There's squash that needs pulling, and if you see any wild mint along the fence, bring it in. Verona worked with the sun warm on her back, her hands in the soil. The earth here was dry but not barren. The garden had been tended with care, and she found herself taking pride in not hurting the roots as she worked. She'd never had much reason to feel useful after her husband passed, but here, every task had a reason. Every hand helped something grow. When Weston came by leading 2 calves back from the creek, he paused at the edge of the garden. She didn't look up at first, too focused on loosening a stubborn squash vine, but she felt his gaze. "You've got dirt on your cheek," he said. She looked up and wiped it with the back of her hand. "Better than hunger in my stomach." His mouth tugged slightly at the corner. "I'll be riding fence again tomorrow. You want to come see the far pasture?" She blinked. "You're asking me?" "I am." She set the squash in the basket and stood. "Then yes." "I'd like that." He tipped his hat and walked on, the calves ambling behind him. That night, Verona lay in bed with her hands folded on her stomach, listening to the wind whistle in the chinks of the window frame. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of it. The saddle felt different with 2. Verona shifted behind him, her skirts gathered carefully to one side, her hands resting uncertainly at her thighs. Weston guided the gelding through a shallow draw lined with rabbit brush and fading lupine, the morning air still cool enough to lift the hair at the back of her neck. "You can hold on if you need," he said without looking back. "I'm managing," she replied, though her knees ached from keeping balance without a grip. They rode on, the terrain slowly opening into wider country. The hills rolled out in soft humps of golden grass, dotted here and there with black cattle moving in loose groups. Weston's dog, a wiry blue heeler named Jasper, darted ahead and circled back, tongue lolling. She watched the land change under the rising sun. "It's emptier than I expected." "It's enough for some," he said. "Others call it lonely." "What do you call it?" He hesitated, then said, "Quiet." "That's not a bad thing." A hawk circled overhead, its cry thin against the sky. Verona leaned forward slightly, her voice lower than before. "Does it ever feel like the silence can swallow you, though?" "Used to," he said. "Now I think of it more like a room kept clean. You can fill it with what you choose." They passed a crooked split-rail fence that Weston dismounted to check. Verona slid down behind him, legs stiff as she landed. He pulled a pair of fencing pliers from his saddlebag and handed her a coil of wire. "You mind holding that?" She nodded, stepping close as he crouched to loop the ends. He worked with practiced calm, his hands steady even when the wire caught and snapped back at his knuckles. "You always fix things yourself?" she asked. "When I can." He looked up briefly. "Nothing teaches you faster than not having someone else to do it." She looked at his hands scarred, sun-darkened, strong in a quiet way. "You ever think about working your own land?" He stood, brushing dirt from his trousers. "Thought about it, but I stayed here after my older brother passed. Someone needed to keep the place running." They mounted again, this time Verona resting her hands lightly at his sides. The touch settled something between them that neither spoke of. An hour deeper into the range, they stopped at a ridge that overlooked a creek swollen just enough from the mountain runoff. Cottonwoods lined the banks, their leaves tossing in the breeze. Weston dismounted first and reached up to steady her as she swung down. His hands were firm at her waist, and for a second longer than needed, he held her before stepping back. She took in the view, silent for a long while. Then, softly, "I thought I'd make it out here with my brother, start over somewhere new. I didn't expect to end up alone." "You're not," Weston said, and his words came without hesitation. She turned toward him. "Why are you so certain?" "Because you're standing here, because you're not the same woman I found 3 days ago." Her breath caught on a reply that didn't come. Instead, she moved to the creek, crouched to let the water run over her fingers. It was cold and fast, and the touch of it grounded her in a way she hadn't felt in months. Behind her, Weston unsaddled the gelding and let him graze. He unpacked a cloth bundle from his saddlebag and brought it to where she sat on a flat rock. Inside were slices of cold cornbread, a wedge of cheese, and 2 apples. They ate without much talk, the quiet between them not uncomfortable now. Verona chewed slowly, the apples sweet and crisp in her mouth. When she finished, she looked over at him. "You always carry 2 apples?" No, he said, offering a rare flicker of humor, but I thought you might like one. She smiled, small but honest. Thank you, he shrugged. Reckon it's no trouble. She looked out over the water again, then back to him. Truth is, I didn't think anyone would be kind to me again, not after everything. He leaned his forearms on his knees, gaze fixed ahead. Most people out here don't take time to see past what's in front of them. But I do. Why? He answered slowly. Because I used to wish someone had done the same for me. The wind picked up, stirring the grass along the bank. Verona stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt, and looked down at Weston. I'd like to keep helping around the ranch. Until I know what direction I'm meant to go, he stood too, adjusting his hat. We've got a milk cow due any day now. Lorna could use a hand watching her in the evenings. I'll do it. All right then. They rode back when the sun tilted westward, their shadows long across the grass. Jasper ran ahead again, chasing something they couldn't see. Verona held on to Weston this time not out of need, but out of something steadier, something just beginning to take root between them. As the ranch came into view, she leaned forward slightly, her voice near his ear. You said this land was quiet. I think maybe it's waiting. For what? For us to decide what we want to fill it with. The milk cow calved just after midnight, and Verona sat with the lantern while Lorna coaxed the slick, knobby-kneed calf onto its feet. The barn was close with warmth and the smell of straw, and when the calf finally stood wobbling under its mother's belly, Lorna let out a breath like she hadn't taken one in 10 minutes. Stubborn little fellow, she muttered, wiping her hands on her apron. But he's through. Verona reached out to steady the lantern. He's smaller than I thought he'd be. First ones usually are. They grow quickly, though. Lorna straightened, joints cracking. I'll see to the feed. You stay with her a bit. She'll be nervous tonight. The door creaked shut behind her, leaving Verona alone with the cow and calf. The mother's lowing was soft, almost a hum. Verona crouched outside the pen and watched the calf nudge his way toward milk, his legs still uncertain. She didn't hear Weston come in. Only noticed when the lantern light shifted and his shadow stretched beside hers. Lorna said you were still up, he murmured. She thought I should sit with them. You don't mind? No, I like the quiet. It settles something. He stepped closer, his voice low to avoid spooking the cow. Most folks get restless when things go still. I've had enough noise for a lifetime. She looked up at him. I used to think the world would stop if I didn't keep moving. Turns out it just waits. He leaned against the stall door, arms crossed. You learn that the hard way, she nodded. After my husband died, I didn't stop for weeks. I sewed, cleaned, took in mending. I thought if I kept going, I wouldn't feel the absences, but they followed anyway. Weston didn't rush to fill the silence. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. I used to walk fence lines at night after my brother drowned. Just walk till my legs gave out. Thought it was better to feel pain in my knees than in my chest. Her gaze didn't leave the calf. Did it help? No. But it tired me out enough to sleep. Verona leaned her temple against the beam beside her. I didn't think anyone would understand that. I didn't think anyone would ask. The calf gave a sudden bleat, and both of them looked as it found its footing and began to nurse in earnest. The cow shifted but didn't protest. Verona smiled faintly. He's learning. They always do. Sometimes it just takes longer than you expect. She looked back at Weston. You think people are the same? He didn't answer at first. Then I think some folks get left behind before they get a chance to learn. And some, he paused, meeting her eyes, some just need someone beside them while they do. Heat rose in her throat, slow and unfamiliar. She stood, brushing straw from her skirt. I should let her rest. Weston opened the stall gate for her. You'll be up early? I will. They walked back toward the house together, the moon casting long shapes across the yard. At the porch, she paused, fingers brushing the edge of the railing. Weston, he stopped beside her. I don't want to keep waiting for something to go wrong, she said. Not anymore. You don't have to, he said, steady as the beam under her hand. She looked at him for a long moment, then reached out, touching her fingers to his sleeve. Good night, he nodded once. Morning comes fast. She stepped inside, and he stood there a moment longer, then turned back toward the barn. Inside her small room, Verona undressed by lantern light, folding her dress over the chair. She lay down with the quilt over her legs, but sleep didn't come right off. Her thoughts moved without panic for the first time in months, drawn not to the past but to the steady way Weston had looked at her. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the world held its breath around her, not waiting for something to break, but letting something begin. By late September, the air had turned crisp enough to sting the lungs at first breath. The hills wore their dried grasses like faded velvet, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone pale gold. Verona worked most mornings in the garden or at the loom Miss Lorna kept in the back room, helping mend blankets for the bunkhouse. She'd grown leaner, but stronger too. Her hands no longer shook when she carried a pail, and the set of her shoulders had changed. She stood straighter now, not from pride but from quiet certainty. On a gray afternoon thick with distant thunder, Weston found her stacking firewood under the eaves of the shed. She wore a man's old coat tied at the waist, a knitted scarf tucked beneath it. He approached with his hat in hand and a look on his face like he'd spent the better part of the day turning something over in his head. "You mind walking a while?" he asked. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Where to?" He nodded toward the rise beyond the barn. "Just a piece up the hill." They didn't speak as they walked, boots soft in the grass, the wind sharp enough to color her cheeks. When they reached the top, Verona saw a small stand of pines gathered around a weathered wooden cross, half hidden behind a windbreak. The wood had aged silver, the carving worn but still legible beneath the lichen. She didn't ask whose grave it was. Weston stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets. He was 17 when he drowned. His name was Ali. He had a way of getting under your skin, always laughing at something. Used to say he'd leave this place the moment he turned 18. Verona folded her arms, watching the trees sway. But he didn't. No, ice was thin that winter. He always thought he was lighter than he was. She looked at Weston's face, not the set of his jaw or the line between his brows, but the softness in his voice when he said his brother's name. "You come here often?" "Only when I need to remember what I'm holding on to." The wind picked up, rustling the pine needles. "I've been thinking," he said. "You've had reason to keep your bags packed. I wouldn't blame you if you still did." "I haven't touched them in weeks," she said. He turned to face her. "You've done more than help around the place. You've made room for things again. I'd forgotten what that felt like." Verona's breath caught. "So had I." Weston reached into his coat pocket and pulled something small from it, a thin leather strap, softened by use with an old brass button sewn onto it. "This was my mother's," he said. "Fastened the collar of her best Sunday dress. She gave it to me when I left home. Said if I ever found someone worth building a life with, I'd know what to do with it." Verona looked at the strap in his hand, then at Weston's face, open, steady, with the kind of gentleness that asked nothing and gave everything. "I don't have a ring," he said, "but I'd like you to stay. Not as a guest, not as a helper, as my wife." She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. The way she stepped forward, the way her hand reached for his, said more than words ever could. Her fingers closed around the leather strap, then around his hand. "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." They married the following Sunday beneath the cottonwoods, with Miss Lorna pressing a bouquet of dried sage and wild aster into Verona's hands. The ranch hands lined up in their cleanest shirts, and one of the older cowboys read scripture from a worn Bible with a cracked spine. Weston stood beside her in his best coat, his hair trimmed, his eyes never leaving hers. Afterward, they shared stew and cornbread in the yard, and someone brought out a fiddle. Verona laughed, real and unguarded, when Weston offered his hand for a dance. They moved slow, without rhythm, but it didn't matter. He held her like he meant it, and she leaned into him like she trusted he always would. That night, after the others had gone back to their bunks and the lanterns had burned down low, Verona sat beside Weston on the porch steps. The stars were clear and the wind carried the scent of the season turning. "I never thought I'd feel at home again," she said. "You didn't find a home," he answered. "You made one." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "With you," he pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice soft in the dark. Always. Years passed. The ranch grew slow and sure. Verona planted herbs beside the garden shed and taught herself to dye wool with roots and flowers. Weston built an addition to the house with his own hands, a room with wide windows and a stove that burned hot through the coldest nights. They filled it with books, maps, and quiet mornings. A child came a daughter with her mother's dark hair and her father's calm. Verona named her Ileana, and Weston held her like something sacred. Miss Lorna wept when she was born and stayed until the girl could walk. They never left the barn. There was no need. The world outside kept changing, but the land stayed true. Seasons turned, fences wore down and were repaired, calves were born and named. Verona and Weston aged with the land, not apart from it. And every night when the sun dipped behind the hills, they sat side by side on the porch with their hands clasped and their hearts at rest, no longer waiting, no longer wandering, just there, together, always.